what we're going to be talking about today, I just wanted to bring you one announcement, courtesy of the power of Snopes and the internet. A couple of weeks ago, we had Hank Platt visiting, and he was speaking on the book of Jonah. And in the course of explaining the book of Jonah, one of the stories that he shared about to illustrate the plausibility of the Jonah account is the story of a fisherman who was swallowed by a whale, and who the whale was later opened and the man was found alive. We just wanted to point out that somebody did some research on this and found out that that story isn't actually accurate. Now, we believe the story of Jonah is accurate, but this story is actually not accurate. And we just wanted to bring it up for you, not as a critique of Hank in any way, but just so that in your conversations with friends, if you're talking about the book of Jonah, that you don't wind up putting your foot in your mouth and saying, well, there's actually this great real story about this fisherman that was swallowed and was later found alive. And somebody kind of points at you and says, no, that's actually on Snopes, or that's on Wikipedia, that's actually not true. So, as with anything that you hear from the pulpit, we should endeavor to be like the Bereans, who took everything that they heard and researched it carefully. And somebody has done us the courtesy of doing that for this story from Jonah. Well, over the next couple of months, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the book of 1 Peter. And as we begin this series, I thought it would be helpful to just pause and be reminded of who the Apostle Peter actually was. And what I'd like to do today is give you a bit of an overview of some of the key moments in Peter's life as they show up in the Gospels. And in particular, I want to camp out in one story that I just think is really significant. As the Lord would have it, this was a story that was mentioned in the breaking of bread this morning. And we're going to just take some time to look at John 21 together, and that time when Jesus intentionally comes alongside Peter after Peter's denied Jesus, and how Jesus actually restores him. Now, I think this is important to do because it's valuable for us to see how transformation takes place in the life of somebody over time. And I used to talk about Peter, and I used to think about Peter, and I would often think about this miracle that took place, where Peter went from being this kind of confused follower of Jesus who seemed to say the wrong thing and put his foot in his mouth all the time, to being this great speaker that we see in the book of Acts, and this amazing transformation that's taken place, where you kind of have to stop and ask the question, how did he go from being that guy who put his foot in his mouth all the time, to being the guy who's actually preaching throughout the book of Acts and leading thousands of people to faith in Jesus? But actually, what I want to propose this morning is that more significant than the power that Peter exerted as a speaker and the way that the Holy Spirit used him to actually bring lots of people to faith in Jesus, more significant than that perhaps, is actually the character transformation that took place in Peter's life. How did Peter go from being somebody who was proud and stubborn to being somebody that when Paul shows up on the scene, and Paul tells us the story of how he went to Jerusalem and opposed Peter face to face when he saw that Peter was somehow distorting the gospel. How does Peter, this hot-headed guy, become someone who actually takes correction? How did that not become the point when the church just kind of split in two because Peter and Paul couldn't get along, and Peter, hot-headed Peter that we've seen throughout the Gospels, just couldn't reconcile himself with the way that Paul had talked with him? How did Peter become the kind of person who actually seems to have experienced character transformation? Somebody who's actually gone from being proud to being humble. How does that actually happen in the life of somebody? So that's the idea that I want to put out before you for us to think about as we look at these different stories. So I want to give you a couple stories that just kind of give you a reminder of the life of Peter. First story I want to share with you, Luke 5. This is where Peter actually encounters Jesus for the first time, or really, not for the first time, but his eyes seem to be open to who Jesus is. And in this story, Jesus has been preaching, Peter's been fishing all night, Jesus comes to the end of his preaching, and he's borrowed the boat from Peter, and Peter has kind of pushed him offshore a little bit. And at the end of that, Jesus says to Peter, hey, let's go fishing. And Peter says, well, I've been fishing all night and we didn't catch anything, but because you say so, I will. And they go out, and in the story, Jesus tells Peter to throw his net out on the other side of the boat. And of course, there's this miraculous catch of fish. And it tells us that the catch of fish is so significant that the nets begin to break and the boats begin to sink. And in that moment, where Jesus has done this amazing thing, the reaction of Peter is fascinating. Because in that moment, Peter can't wait to get away from Jesus. He's a commercial fisherman who makes his money catching fish. And in the moment where Jesus delivers this fantastic miracle, which would have been economically very good for Peter, Peter's thought in that moment is, he says it out loud, he says, "Depart from me, O Lord, for I am a sinful man." And in that moment, we know what's happened because it mirrors what we see throughout the Old Testament, that anytime people come into the presence of God, they immediately think they're coming undone. We sing lots of songs about coming into the presence of God, and yet anytime it seems like that anybody really comes into the presence of God and their eyes are open to see who God is, and they catch a glimpse of His holiness, their first thought is, "I've got to get out of here. I'm coming undone." And this happens to Peter, and yet in that moment where he says, "Depart from me," Jesus actually responds and says, "Don't be afraid, from now on you'll be catching fish." And he invites Peter to follow him, and Peter leaves everything to follow Jesus. So Peter's story, as it were, it begins with this dramatic encounter with Jesus where he catches a glimpse of who Jesus actually is. And it changes everything for him, and he begins to follow Jesus. I don't imagine Peter ever forgot that moment of being confronted with his own sin and brokenness in the person of Jesus, but then being invited in the grace of Jesus to actually follow him. Next story, Peter walks on water. So another famous moment in Peter's life, Jesus comes walking across the water to a boat full of disciples in the middle of the night, in the middle of the storm. And in that moment, Peter sees Jesus and he says, "If it's really you, invite me to come out." And Jesus invites him to come out in the water. And of course, Peter very famously steps out of the boat. Nobody else does, but Peter does. That's the guy that Peter is. He steps out of the boat, takes a couple steps, but then he gets distracted by the wind and the waves, and fear fills his heart. He looks away from Jesus, and he begins to sink. And Jesus pulls him back up out of the water and actually says to him, "Oh, you have little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt?" And I share this story with you again as we're being reminded of who Peter is, because it's a great picture of who Peter is. He's this guy that leads out. On the one hand, he's incredibly bold, and yet he has just enough faith to be kind of dangerous to himself. He has enough faith to get out of the boat, but not enough faith to actually walk across the water to Jesus. He's easily distracted. He's the only disciple to get out of the boat, and yet his faith is only strong enough to get himself into a bit of trouble here. He's someone who maybe likes to think of himself as having great faith, but in practice, it's not totally there yet. In Matthew 16, we have this great moment again where Jesus is asking the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they give him some answers. And then he says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter hits the nail on the head. He's the guy that gets it right. He answers the question properly. And he tells Jesus, "You're the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus says, "Yeah, you got it, Peter. That's exactly right. And that wasn't revealed to you by man, but by God himself." And you have this kind of holy moment where Peter gets it right. And yet the moment right after that Matthew kind of points out in the way that he tells the stories, he says shortly after that, Peter decides to pull Jesus aside and rebuke him, because Jesus has once again been talking about the fact that he's going to go to Jerusalem to die. And Peter decides that this is a good moment. Enough of this talk about dying, Jesus. I'm going to pull you aside and have a quiet conversation with you. I'm going to rebuke you. You've got to stop talking like that. That's not what's going to happen. This isn't the way for a king to talk. And Peter rebukes Jesus, and Jesus in turn rebukes Peter in very strong language. He calls him Satan, telling him that he's a hindrance to what God actually wants to accomplish. And again, you've got this phenomenal moment where on the one hand, Peter gets it so right, and then immediately gets it so wrong. He just kind of misses the point. Luke 22. We've got this moment, which I suspect is probably the low moment in the life of Peter. Right after the disciples have been arguing about who's going to be the greatest, Jesus points out to Peter that Peter will deny him 3 times. He will deny knowing him 3 times. And not in a small way, but in a public setting, at a time when Jesus would most want his support. And not just once, but 3 times. So sure enough, after Jesus is arrested, we know how the story goes. Peter's accused by a servant girl. So this isn't a court or a judge or someone of importance, but a servant girl says, "Weren't you with Jesus? Aren't you one of his?" And Peter denies it. And then when he's pressed on it, he denies Jesus again and again. And he actually curses and says, "I swear I don't know the man." And then the rooster crows. And surely that must be the low point of Peter's life, right? He spent 3 years getting to know Jesus, learning to follow him, seeing Jesus do amazing things. He's told everybody, if everybody else denies you, Jesus, not this guy. And then he denies him. Well, the final story that I want to share with you is the one that we're going to take some time to unpack together. It's John 21. Starting at verse 1. And as we read John 21, I just want to give you a little piece of context to keep in mind in terms of where the narrative fits in the book of John. John 21 kind of feels like a bit of an add-on to the rest of the Gospel of John. The first 20 chapters kind of feel like a coherent piece. But then John 21 kind of feels like a bit of an add-on. Because Jesus in John 20 we've got the resurrection, we've got Jesus kind of talking to the disciples, we've got Jesus actually sending them out with the words, as the Father has sent me, so send I you. Jesus has appeared, Thomas's doubt has been dealt with, and the story kind of seems wrapped up, and then John 21 kind of feels like an add-on on the end. It's not an add-on. We can see kind of how it fits, because up until now, the story that John has told, Peter has been incredibly present in that story. Peter's been all over the place in that story. And there's obviously a loose end that needs to be tied up here, because Peter has denied Jesus. And suddenly Peter is strangely silent in John chapter 20. So John has to tie up what happens with Peter. And here's how he does it. Here's the story that he tells us about how Jesus does that. So after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing, and they said to him, we'll go with you. They went out into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet his disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, Children, do you have any fish? They answered him, No. He said to them, Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some. So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. Now, if that story sounded familiar to what we read earlier in Luke 5, it should. I actually think that what Jesus has done here is brilliant. The way that Jesus is going to bring reconciliation and restoration with Peter is by bringing Peter back to the beginning. He's going to bring Peter right back to that place where Peter first encountered Jesus and his eyes were first opened to understand who Jesus actually was. You can just imagine Jesus orchestrating this situation and kind of putting it together so that he would have this opportunity to bring Peter back in. So the disciples have gone back home. Maybe they're unsure of their next steps. Peter suggests a fishing trip, so they go. Now, again, these guys are professional fishermen. They know what they're doing. The story goes the same way again as it did in Luke 5. They fish all night and they catch nothing. And then suddenly Jesus again tells them, throw the net out on the other side of the boat. Now this was an unprofessional activity. Okay, so the way that they would have been fishing was very specific. They would have stretched out a net between 2 boats. They would have kind of made a wall with the net. And then they would have kind of gathered a school of fish in there and tried to throw a net over top, a weighted net over top, so that they could bring the net in. This was a very structured way of fishing. And what Jesus was, in a sense, telling them to do by telling them to throw the net out on the other side of the boat was a Hail Mary. This was just a long pass into nowhere with little hope of accomplishing anything in their minds. Because they didn't have if they were going to throw the net out, the weighted net on the other side of the boat, they didn't have the wall, the net wall anymore. They had no kind of strategy. It was just kind of sure, we'll throw a net out on the other side of the boat. And yet they do it. And of course, as they do it, they weren't able to bring the net in because of the quantity of fish. The story continues that disciple whom Jesus loved, John's not so subtle about his relationship with Jesus. A disciple whom Jesus loved, therefore said to Peter, It is the Lord. Then when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, but about 100 yards off. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid out on it and bread. Jesus said to them, Bring some of the fish that you've just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. Anytime you see something as specific as that in a story like this, you should stop and think, why is it there? Why would they tell us there's 153 fish that show up on the shore? The answer is because there's 153 fish. All these specific stories like that kind of start to feel more like a news report where they're actually just telling you what happened. 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So, I just want you to see, in this story that Jesus is putting together here, this scenario that he's put together to draw Peter back to himself, he's gone back to the beginning. So he's mirrored something that happened in Luke 5. But more than that, he's done a miraculous catch of fish again. But look at Peter's reaction. The first time Peter deals with a miraculous catch of fish, and he's out in a boat with Jesus, what's his reaction? He wants to get away. He wants to get away from Jesus. "Depart from me, O Lord, for I'm a sinful man." In that moment when he first saw Jesus, and his eyes were open, and he was confronted with his own sin, he couldn't wait to get away from Jesus. And yet what happens this time? Somebody says, "It's Jesus." And what does Peter do? He jumps out of the boat again. He wants to jump out of the boat. But he wants to do it to get as close to Jesus as possible. Now that's a great picture of the gospel, isn't it? Isn't that a great picture of the gospel of what happens when we're in a relationship with Jesus? When we're first confronted with our sin, our thought is, turn the light off. I don't want to see that anymore, Jesus. I don't want to think about that, and I don't want you to see me as I am. And yet as we walk with Jesus over time, we begin to realize that he loves us in the midst of our sin. So that when we find ourselves caught in sin, our reaction isn't to shut the light out and run away, but it's actually to run to Jesus. I love this about Peter's got 100 things wrong in his life, and yet he's got the right reaction here. When confronted with sin, he runs to Jesus. Jesus invites them to have breakfast. A great picture of fellowship again. Jesus provides some bread and fish, but then he invites them to participate. And again, one of the images that we've got here, very specifically, John tells us that he's got a charcoal fire. Now, people have kind of guessed at all kinds of different reasons why it's significant that John would include the detail that this was a fire of coals or a charcoal fire. I actually think that the reason this was significant is because this was the place where Peter denied Jesus. That actually that's what we're told about where Peter was when he denied Jesus. He was gathered around a fire of coals, trying to warm himself when the servant girl confronts him. So again, Jesus builds this beautiful story just for Peter, so that Peter would understand Jesus' love for him. When they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." And he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said it to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Did you notice how the tone of the conversation changed? Or how the conversation actually starts? So Jesus invites them in. Now, significantly, what did Jesus do? What was one of the things that Jesus did when he first met Simon Peter? He gave him a new name, right? We have this guy whose whole life has been called Simon, and then Jesus sees him and he's like, "You're Peter. You're Peter. That's who you are." And then we come back to this place here, and as Jesus deals with sin in his life, what does Jesus call him? Simon, son of John. Kind of feels like your mom calling you out on something, doesn't it? Do you love me more than these? Well, more than what? Do you love me more than the 153 fish? Do you love me more than others do, maybe? You know, it's interesting because Peter has actually significantly told people and told Jesus that he loves him more than other people love him, right? Matthew 26, Peter answered him, "Even if They all fall away because of you. Not this guy. I will never fall away. John 13:37. Lord, why can't I follow you now? I'll lay down my life for you. And you get this sense that throughout Peter's life and in his relationship with Jesus, on the one hand, there's this beautiful eagerness, this desire to get close to Jesus, and yet at the same time, he seems to consistently imply that he loves Jesus more than other people do. Do you love me more than these? You know, this whole section is ultimately about dealing with Peter's 3 denials of Jesus, which you guys already know, right? We see how 3 times Peter denies Jesus, 3 times Jesus asks him, do you love me? And Peter affirms it. And yet what I want you to see is that I don't think Peter's denial of Jesus was kind of like a one little moment kind of thing. I actually think what Jesus is doing here is he's dealing with a pattern of sin in Peter's life. He's dealing with a particular aspect of Peter's life that's broken and kind of putting his finger on it in a painful way in front of some other people and saying, Peter, do you love me more than these? And there's a grace to it and a kindness to it, and yet at the same time, Jesus is putting his finger on sin in Peter's life and saying, Peter, you said you'd die for me. You said if everybody else left, you wouldn't leave. You've kind of made a big deal out of showing everybody that you love me more than the others, and yet, Peter, do you love me more than these guys do? Peter, do you love me? To the point where Peter's grieved because a 3rd time he says to him, do you love me? There's some nuance in the Greek in the word love that's used there, where Jesus repeatedly uses the word agape. Do you agape? Do you love me without condition? And Peter repeatedly responds with phileo, a Greek word that means brotherly love, or kind of it would seem a lower form of love. And while these words often are used interchangeably in the same way that I might say that, I might ask Lonnie, do you love me? And she might say, like, yeah, I care really deeply for you. I really care about you. And that wouldn't be her saying, I don't actually love you. That might just be her expressing it in a different set of words. And there's a sense in which that's true in the way that the Greek is used. It could just be that. And yet at the same time, it seems like Jesus is putting his finger on an issue in Peter's life here and wanting Peter to understand that he may not love him as much as he thinks he does. He may not love him unconditionally. Because the heart of the issue isn't just that Peter denied Jesus, but that Peter, somebody who's broken. I mean, what kind of a person, let's just be honest, what kind of a person is sitting around in a crowd of people and looks around and just says, if everyone else fails you, I'm not going to do it? How misled was Peter about his small love for Jesus? That he would look around at a group of people, his peers, and say, Jesus, the rest of these guys are schmucks. They're going to desert you, but I will never, that's not me, Jesus. I'm that guy. I will never do this. How misled was he about the state of his own heart, about the brokenness in him, that he would say something like that? What Jesus is pointing out is not that Peter didn't love Jesus, but that Peter didn't love Jesus as much as he thought he did. And in response to Peter actually acknowledging this, Jesus actually instructs him to take responsibility for his flock. There's a bunch of stuff that we could say about the connection between Peter's confession and the work that Jesus gives him to do, but at very least, I just want to put out there this idea that one of the things that qualified Peter to care for the sheep was his recognition of his small and imperfect love for Jesus. It was his own recognition of his brokenness that actually qualified him to be able to care for other people. How could he be a leader with any kind of empathy and care for others if he didn't at least recognize in himself that he was somebody who didn't love Jesus nearly as much as he thought he did? Quality that God looks for those in whom he's going to entrust leadership is brokenness. Because brokenness allows us to actually be people of empathy and vulnerability. And that's the kind of community that Jesus invites us into. The kind of community where sin is dealt with because we're honest with one another about our weaknesses and our brokenness. And that's where people change. The story ends like this. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you're old, you will stretch out your hands and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this to him, he said, follow me. I love that. He finishes it with the same thing that he said to Peter the first time, which is in Luke 5. Follow me. If you can accept this now, you didn't know what it was all about 3 years ago when we started this adventure, but if you can accept that this is who you are and this is who I am, then follow me. Now it feels out of sync, right? Because he's just said all this stuff about love, so why is he then going and talking about death? Why is he saying to Peter, when you get old, people are going to lead you where you don't want to go, you're going to stretch out your hands, you're going to die, you're actually going to be killed on my behalf? How does that fit with the things that Jesus is actually saying to him? Well, I think it actually kind of affirms what I was thinking earlier. That Peter, over and over again, claimed that if everybody else deserted Jesus, he wouldn't do it, and that he was ready to lay down his life for Jesus. And I think what Jesus is finishing this moment of restoration with in the life of Peter is by saying, listen, Peter, if you can accept that you don't love me as much as you do, as you think you do, and you're still willing to follow me and to trust me, then one day you will actually die. One day you will actually go all the way. And I think what Jesus is hinting at in the life of Peter here is this sense of process. That when Peter said all those things, he didn't understand the fullness of what actually was going to happen. He didn't understand it all. And yet Jesus invited him into it. And what Jesus finishes by saying here is like, listen, you didn't understand what it meant back then to actually follow me and lay down your life. And as a result, you denied me. And yet if you keep following me, that's where you're going. Are you willing to walk that path? Because this is what it means to follow me. While Peter may have thought he understood what it meant 3 years earlier when Jesus said, follow me, 3 years later he has a much better understanding of what it means when Jesus says it again. So what do we do with this story? Where does this bring us? How would we apply something from this interaction that Jesus has with Peter? Well, one of the things that I think that this has led me to consider is simply the fact that I need to pay attention to my own heart, because out of my heart flows all kinds of sin, sinful behavior. And if I don't actually understand my own heart, if I don't understand my own brokenness, then I'm liable to trip and fall in the ways that Peter did. As we grow spiritually, and we get involved in church, sometimes we get really good at sin management. And what I mean by that is we learn kind of the things to say and the things not to say and the ways to act. And yet it doesn't necessarily reflect a deep transformation that's taken place in our heart. We've just learned kind of how to manage some outward symptoms. And I think what this story is about is Jesus putting his finger on an issue in Peter's life and saying, listen, you figured out the dance steps, but I actually want you to hear the music. I actually want you to understand what's going on in your own heart. I want you to actually experience real transformation. We learn how to suppress sin, and yet our heart is still kind of strangely drawn towards it, and we don't understand it, and sometimes we're caught off guard by it. One of the things that I've so appreciated about being involved in Power to Change has been that we've had this emphasis historically on the importance of walking in the power of the Spirit. And in our teaching on that, we put a big emphasis on the value of ongoing confession. The fact that we just need to, as soon as we're aware of sin in our lives, we need to deal with it before God and just confess that sin so that we can walk in right relationship with God. I so appreciated that. If I can critique my own organization, the one way that that's kind of brought me off track in a certain sense is that in wanting to deal quickly with sin, I've often dealt shallowly with sin in my life. In wanting to deal quickly with issues that arise in my life, by confessing them and just saying, Lord, I acknowledge that that's wrong and I want to go in the opposite direction, I haven't actually always dealt deeply with sin that pops up in my life. I haven't actually taken the time to actually stop and say, why? Why am I drawn towards that? I repent of a behavior without actually considering what the deeper issue might be in my life that's actually pushing me towards that kind of sin. I yell at my kids, and then I confess it immediately to them and to God. But I don't pause to say, what's going on in my life that I want to yell at my kids? I go, like, what's the thing beneath the surface, the control that I'm fighting for that makes me the kind of person who would yell at my kids when they disobey me? And I think that's what's happening in Peter's life here, is that Jesus is putting his finger on something and saying, like, hey, Peter, I know. We know that you're proud. We know that you're brash. But why? What's beneath the surface that you haven't acknowledged, that you haven't realized, or that you haven't accepted, that you need to begin to wrestle with? We held a conference a couple of weeks ago for our ministry, for our French ministry actually, and we invited a whole bunch of different guest speakers in. And probably the most profound moment of the conference for me, we invited a pastor in the morning to speak on what is the gospel. And he did a great job in 30 minutes of just unpacking from the scriptures what was the gospel. And then we had a counselor come in and actually talk from a biblical perspective and an understanding of our emotions. What does it mean to actually appropriate the gospel? How does the gospel actually bring change into the way that we live and act? And then we had a panel discussion, and we invited the counselor to bring somebody in who was experiencing transformation in their life and to share her story. I will just be honest and say we did not vet this very carefully. I did not know what the story was going to be, so it was quite shocking. So this woman sat down, and she said, I said, well, why don't you share a little bit of your story with us? And she said, well, my story is quite simple. When I was a teenager, I became addicted to drugs, and particularly to crack cocaine. And that led me to lose everything that I had. I was kicked out of my house, I was living on the streets, and I became a prostitute. And after several years of living like this, one night I remember I cried out to God and said, save me. She said, I woke up the next morning, and I was free from the addiction to crack cocaine. And I knew that God had done it. She said, so I immediately went to a church and found a pastor who said, this is what's happened. Tell me what it means now to follow Jesus. Unbelievably powerful story, right? I think all of us at that moment, we weren't expecting it. So we're all just like, what just happened? Who is this person? And so she shares this powerful story, but the most significant thing that she said that struck me was she said, in a moment, God freed me from this physical addiction, this chemical addiction to drugs. And she said, and yet it took me 20 years to actually begin to understand what was broken in my heart that would lead me to actually live in that kind of an addictive pattern. She said, in a moment, God freed me. And it wasn't a draw anymore to go towards drugs. And she said, and yet, for the next number of years, with my focus, with that issue out of my life, I found myself continually being drawn to other things, to other addictive patterns of behaviors, to relationships, and all kinds of different things. And it just took time for God to begin to put his finger on issues in my life that I would understand what is wrong in my heart that draws me towards these different things. That's Peter's story, right? In an instant, in a boat in the middle of the sea, he realizes who Jesus is, and the spotlight shines on his sin, and he's like, get away from me, Jesus. And Jesus says, follow me. You have nothing to fear. And yet there's this ongoing process in Peter's life of actually putting to death sin and understanding why he is the kind of person who is proud. Why he is the kind of person who thinks so highly of himself and so little of others. And that was the work that Jesus was doing in his life. I love this about Jesus, that Jesus doesn't just leave Peter kind of wrestle with this on his own. But Jesus actually intentionally creates this whole scenario that we get to kind of peek in on, where Jesus has pulled Peter aside and decided to deal with a deep issue in Peter's heart. Peter, do you love me more than these? We underestimate our own brokenness as people. And we become very good at sin management. We figure out how to not say the thing or not do the thing. And yet the real transformation occurs as we begin to understand what draws me to that. Where am I looking for satisfaction that can't satisfy me? as opposed to actually finding hope and meaning in life in the person of Jesus. The story that's stood out to me that kind of emphasizes this as well has been the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel, in the story we've got these two brothers, the first two brothers. And we know that Cain offers a sacrifice and Abel offers a sacrifice. And Cain just seems quite sure that Abel's sacrifice was accepted and his was not. And God intervenes at that point in the story and actually says to Cain, "Why are you angry?" It's an excellent question. I actually asked myself that question quite a bit now. Why are you angry? And he says, sin is crouching at your door, wanting to devour you. Why is your face fallen? And of course, Abel doesn't respond particularly well. He just goes and kills his brother. And it's one way. But that question that God asks him as he's in the midst of temptation, why are you angry? It's just such a great question. He's actually pushing Cain to think through the impulse in his heart that's driving him, that's pushing him towards sin, in the midst of that sin. So, as a simple, single point of application, can I push you to ask the question this week of why? Steph was over at our house this week, and Lonnie and I had this really awkward moment. This is a common awkward moment in our life, it would seem. But we had been invited out to a party, and we suddenly realized, we were getting ready to go, we'd arranged for a babysitter, we were getting dressed up, and last possible sec, we texted a friend to say, hey, can we get a ride with you to this party? And the friend texted back and said, what party? And we said, and then they texted again and said, actually the party's not for another month, you got the date wrong by a month, which is a pattern in our lives. This is the third party in the last 2 years, I think, that we were off by a day or a month or a week. Okay, so in that moment, right, there is a great temptation in my heart to blame. Right? Husbands and wives, you can agree with me here? This is what we do, right? In those moments, when something like that happens and you're both frustrated, there's a great temptation to blame. And you know, we're nice enough people now that we've learned to kind of shut our mouths at that moment. Right? For the most part, we just kind of pause and we're like, we know, we can see that we're both looking at each other and thinking, this was your fault. Steph knows that she was there. Right? And you're trying to shut your mouth. And yet, in the midst of that situation, can I suggest that the most helpful thing for me was to actually pause and say, Lord, why am I tempted to blame my wife? What is it that I'm trying to protect in myself? What lie am I believing in this moment? What is the thing that's actually happening at a deeper level? I can suppress the part of me in a really just healthy way that says I'm just not going to blame. We're actually both looking at our cell phones trying to figure out who had sent the text that said that the baby's wrong. And there's a part of me in that moment that was like, okay, I can do this. I can put my phone down. And yet if I miss the moment right now of actually asking myself, Andy, why does it take everything in you to keep from picking that phone back up and kind of scrolling through your text to see who made the mistake? Why is it that you need to be right? Why is it that you want to blame your wife and you're more comfortable with her being wrong than with you being wrong? What is the thing that's actually happening in your heart in this moment? And I can tell you, if I don't stop and in those moments deal with my heart, real change isn't going to happen. If I'm not actually aware in that moment of why it is that I'm drawn towards sin and what the idol is in my life, real change isn't going to happen. And that's what I want, right? I want to become more like Jesus. I want to be transformed to be more like Christ. I want my life to exude the love of Christ. But unless I can begin to root out in my heart the ways that I'm tempted to go in the opposite direction, real change doesn't happen. So I offer you one piece of homework for the week. In a moment of temptation this week, or maybe in a moment after you've actually sinned, please bring that to Jesus and say, and actually confess your sin. But in confessing your sin, would you actually take a moment as well and say, Lord, why am I angry? Why am I acting in a proud way? What's going on in my heart that draws me in this direction right now? And would you change me? Would you make me aware of what brokenness and sin looks like in my heart? And would you change me? To me, that's the power of Peter's story. It's not that he went on to preach the book of Acts. It's that God actually, and I love that. I'm all about that. It's that God actually got a hold of his heart and began to change him so that he would act more like Jesus. Let's pray. Father, would you increasingly make us people who are aware of the work that your Spirit is doing in our lives of convicting us of sin. Jesus, you said it's better that you would go, that the Spirit would come, and that when the Spirit came, that he would convict the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment, and our need for a Savior. Jesus, I pray for us as a people this week, would we be people who hear the voice of your Spirit convicting us of sin and pointing out to us the places in our life that are broken that need to be rebuilt. Pray that we would increasingly reflect the image and likeness of Christ. We pray this in his name.